1 Thessalonians, as you can see on your handout, chapter 5. And then we're also going to start 2 Thessalonians, and Lord willing, get into chapter 1 too. And probably, I would say you talked a little bit, at least last week, toward the end of chapter 4, about the second coming of Christ. And of course, that's the subject here of chapter 5, and really the whole book of 2 Thessalonians deals with the idea in different ways. But question number 1 on your handout, think about a question. The question is this: how do you react when you hear predictions about the end of the world? Anybody ever heard a prediction about the end of the world? Yeah? Okay, how do you generally react whenever you hear those things?
Scoff.
Okay? Scoff. What else?
No, they're not true.
Okay? No, they're not true, right?
No, it's not going to happen on that day.
Yeah, one preacher said, if somebody did guess the day, God would change the day. Not going to happen, is it?
And some of these predictions are based on the Bible, but it just strikes me at how unlearned and ignorant the people are that's doing these predictions.
Yeah, there's some pretty obvious verses when you look at the Bible that discuss the timing of Christ's return, and how basically there is no way imaginable that we could ever know. And the predictions, though, the predictions of Jesus' return, they're not something that are unique to our time. I think there's probably been somebody in every age who claims to be able to interpret some signs as the signs that indicate that Jesus' return is soon. I can remember growing up and going through high school, I can remember a number of my friends being bent out of shape because their preacher told them, they said, well, the signs indicate that Jesus is coming back real soon. And so they were banking on that idea. But I guess as you read the New Testament epistles, it shouldn't surprise us that there were people who thought that the signs of the times indicated that the return of Jesus was soon. And so that's really what we're reading about here on the part of, the end of 1 Thessalonians here in chapter 5, and also, like I said, the first part in, the whole epistle of 2 Thessalonians. So we're going to be talking about the Lord's coming and some facts that the Bible teaches, and of course, some things that Paul reminded, I guess we should say, the Thessalonian Christians concerning the return of Christ. So let's start reading here. Somebody read. Let's just read the first 3 verses here in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, and then we'll look at question number 2.
But concerning the time and the seasons, brethren, you have no need that I should write to you. For you yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night. And then they say, peace and safety, and suddenly destruction comes upon them, as labor pains upon a pregnant woman. They shall not escape.
Okay, so question number 2 is this: when and how will the Lord return? Based upon what we just read there. Okay, that's how he's going to return, right? When will he return?
We don't know.
You can almost, I chuckle to myself sometimes when I read these epistles, because, maybe it's just from the standpoint of a preacher or something, when you've told somebody something and you've told them, but somehow they come out with a different idea. That's kind of what that's kind of where he's at here. It's almost like he's writing a reprimand, isn't it? Notice if he says there in verse 1, he said, you guys don't need me to write to you. And it kind of points out there in verse 2, you yourselves already know this completely, perfectly, absolutely. There's nothing else that I can tell you. There's no more information that I can offer to you. It's something that you already know yourselves, and you know it backward and forward and inside and out. And so the idea that I get when I kind of read that is, it's almost like Paul's saying, how many times do I have to tell you this? How many times do I have to tell you? We don't know. We have no idea when Christ is going to return. There is one thing, though, as Lanny pointed out, that's sure about the return of Christ, and that is that he's going to come as a thief in the night, right? How does a thief in the night come? What time does he come?
You never know.
Yeah. He doesn't call you beforehand, does he? He doesn't give you any warning. Gives another example there, and I hesitate to use it because I don't know anything about it, but it says like pains that come upon a pregnant woman. Maybe some of the women can shed light for us on that. Did you know the exact time you were going to give birth? Now, usually they set a due date, right? We have things where you induce labor and things like that. But as far as the exact timing as to when that was going to happen, you didn't know. You know, you have those labor pains that come upon you, and then, I don't know, with my wife, we had a lot of false alarms with us too, but you think it's coming, but it's not. But you just don't know for sure when that time is going to be. And so you would think, you know, with the Bible being so clear, and even when you go over to the teachings of Christ, you know, when Christ was talking to his apostles about the idea of his return in Mark chapter 13 and verse 32, he says, "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father." I mean, with verses as obvious as that, wouldn't you think that people could just accept the fact that we don't have any idea when Christ is going to return? Why can't people accept that fact? We want to know, don't we? You know, it's important. It's a world-shaking event, and we want to have at least a clue, don't we? I mean, we don't want to be totally in the dark here, but we want to have some idea. We want to be able to look out and to see something and to point to it and say, well, Jesus' return must be close. You remember in Acts chapter 1 and verse 7, you remember the apostles, or at least those group of believers, asked Jesus. They said, "Lord, when are you going to restore the kingdom of Israel, or the kingdom to Israel?" Remember what Jesus said to them there? He said, "It's not for you to know the times and the seasons that God has put in his mind." So basically, there are some things that it's none of our business, you know, when they're going to happen. And the return of Christ is one of those things that God does not want us to have any inkling of when that is going to happen. Yes, sir.
These are guys that was a group that had these predictions Jesus was going to come. They had the time and the date, or the date and time, and they sold all their stuff, and it was up on top of the fruit that was waiting. Of course, nothing happened.
Yeah.
They were surprised, I guess.
Yeah.
And in 2000, remember 2000, everybody said the war would come in. 2000 happened, and similar kind of deal. So anything that people could start running numbers on, they had formulas they were using, all stuff like that. And people believe it. A lot of people believe it.
Yeah, and again, I think the reason why is because, you know, it's such an important event, and we just, as humans, we want to think that we're going to have some kind of warning, you know, that we're going to have some kind of indication of when this is going to turn. Yes, sir.
I think to some degree the desire to know when's the end of the world, whether it's sort of the secular Y2K end of the world thing, or if it's the coming of Christ, whether you're a Christian or not, I think it's a worldly fear. It's how much time do I have left? Whether it's how much time do I have left to get it right, or how much time do I have left to spend with my wife, my children. I think it's fear-driven based on, I just want to know how much time I have so I can cram as much life into it as I can.
Yeah.
I mean, because even if you're fully assured in your heart that you're going to heaven, you still want to spend time with the people you love.
Yeah.
So I think it's a worldly fear that makes people want to know when's it going to happen. When's it going to happen?
Yeah, and again, it's just, you know, like the Bible tells us in Deuteronomy 29:29, there's some secrets that just belong to God. You know, if there's a reason God didn't tell us, because he doesn't want us to know. And so, you know, to read statements like that in the Bible where it's just clear as day, you know, where Jesus says nobody knows. You know, the angels in heaven don't know, even the Son, Jesus, while he was on earth, he didn't know, did he, when that time was going to be? Only the Father knew. And so, again, you think about Paul writing here. He's saying, you know, I don't need to write to you about this. You know, you guys already know everything that you can know. You have perfect knowledge that we know nothing about the timing of the return of Christ. And so it's one, again, a question I think that everybody in the world wants to be able to answer, but the reality of it is, as far as divine information or revelation or indication, there are none of those things that are given to us in the Scripture. Go ahead, Daryl.
We do know a little bit about the coming of Christ. And the people in the Old Testament, they knew that there were going to be a number of events happen. The prophets predicted it, the coming of Jesus Christ, destruction of Jerusalem, and a lot of things like that. They knew all that stuff was going to happen before Judgment Day or anything. But we went through all that, and as far as I can tell, God doesn't have anything else that He's going to come bring about here on earth, such as those things. We're in the last days.
Yeah.
We just don't know how long the last days are going to last.
Yeah. And what's interesting is when you get over into 2 Thessalonians, and I won't go too far ahead of us, but of course Paul points out there, they did know there were some things that were going to happen before Christ did return. They did know that there were certain things that had to take place before Jesus returned. But as far as that indicating the time when He was going to return, it really wasn't a timetable or a timeline in any way. But it is kind of interesting to read about those things, Lord willing, when we'll get there. We'll look at them a little bit more in depth. But question number 3 here is, so what influence should the promise of Christ's return have on how we live today? Should it affect how we live? Yeah, he basically, if you look verses 4 through 8 there, he basically talks about 2 different groups of people. He talks about a group of people that live in darkness and drunkenness. That's the way that he describes it. When you think about a person living in darkness, what do you think about? Okay. Yeah, generally it describes a worldly individual, doesn't it? A person who is wicked, a person who's evil, a person who's engrossed in sin. If we live like that, it's like we're failing to see the light. We're failing to see our purpose for being here. We're failing to see that one day Christ is going to return. He's going to come. He's going to judge us for these things. We're going to be held accountable. A person who's lives in drunkenness, it's like his senses aren't all there, right? Can't think clearly, can't react clearly, and that's one way of living on this earth here. We can just pretend like Christ isn't coming, and we can just go out and feel like every day's a free day to do whatever we want to do. But Christians aren't supposed to live like that. Christians, Paul describes their lifestyle as light and sobriety. And he also mentions the idea of a Christian's going to have practice faith. They're going to have hope. They're going to practice love. Talks about how those things are like our breastplate and our helmet. They're the things as a soldier of Christ that are going to keep us fighting the battle and ultimately winning the war. So, the promise of Jesus' return should have a huge impact upon the way that we choose to live here upon this earth. Question number 4 here, to what does God appoint Christians? Somebody read verses 9 and 10 for us here. 1 Thessalonians 5, 9 and 10.
God hath not appointed us to wrath, but to attain salvation by our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us, that whether we wait or sleep, we should live together with Him.
Okay, so what does God appoint Christians? Maybe I should start by asking, to what, or I can't get it worded here. What does God not appoint Christians to? I'm going to use the preposition at the end. Wrath. Right? That's a Christian. When Christ returns, do we have to fear the wrath of God? Is that what God has appointed for us? No, it's not the wrath of God coming down upon us, but what is it?
Salvation.
Yeah, it's salvation. I mean, that's what we're living for, isn't it? That's what we're waiting for. That's what we want. And it's not going to be accomplished until Christ comes back. When He comes back, He's going to give it to us. Christians are going to receive it. And so as a Christian, do I have anything to be afraid of when Christ comes back? God hasn't appointed me to have His wrath poured out upon me. What He has appointed is salvation, deliverance. And so as Christians, that's what we should be looking forward to whenever Christ returns. So question number 5, how should a believer use this information to help others? What does he say in verse 11 there? What can we do with these things we've just read about?
First, we should comfort ourselves, and then we should go ahead and try to edify one another for that purpose.
Yeah, those words should be comforting to us, shouldn't they? Again, when you think about when Christ comes back, He's not coming out coming back to pour out God's wrath on me. He's coming back to save me, to deliver me. And I think it kind of goes back full circle to what were they afraid of in chapter 4? Do you remember? We'll see how good Scott did or how well your memory is, maybe. What were they afraid of in chapter 4 there? Yeah. So you did good, didn't he? Will had his listening ears on last week. They were concerned about their loved ones who had died before them. You know, well, what's going to happen to them? You know, if Christ's coming back and he's going to save us, what's going to be their fate? How are all those things going to work out? And so he points out, of course, those who have died are still alive. You know, they're not out here in the grave unconscious, but they're still alive. And when Christ comes back, he's going to bring us all back together again. You know, that's one of the things as Christians that I look forward to. When Christ returns, the reunion. You know, being reunited with all of our family who have been saved, who obeyed the gospel before us, to all of our friends who have passed on from this life. That's something that we should look forward to as Christians, isn't it? Being reunited. And so, is it comforting to think of the return of Christ? For a Christian, it is, isn't it? And so, Paul says, use these words to comfort, to reassure one another. If you look at the rest of chapter 5 here, he basically leaves some final instructions. These, of course, would have been peculiar situations to the church at Thessalonica, but of course there's broad application in all these things that we study. Question number 6 here. Well, somebody read verses 12 and 13 for us here in 1 Thessalonians 5.
And we beseech you, brethren, to know them which labor among you and are over you in the Lord, and admonish you, and to esteem them very highly in love for your work's sake, and be at peace among yourselves.
Okay, we study the Bible. Paul has to be writing about elders here. Those are the ones who are over us in the Lord. But based on those verses there, how does God want us to regard elders within the church?
Esteem them very highly.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that really pop out to me, you know, about this verse itself. If you go on, you read through it, it kind of indicates to me, I think, the indication of these passages is that some church discipline had been practiced. You know, and people have mixed feelings about church discipline, especially when you're talking about your own flesh and blood. And so maybe there's a little bit of tension within the church here at Thessalonica. But chapter, again, the second epistle kind of bears that out a little bit more. There were some people who'd been disorderly and who had action had to be taken against them. But he points out, of course, elders. One of the things that pops out to me in verse 12, you know, that's a labor. When you talk about a person being an elder, you're not just talking about honoring them with a position, you know, giving them a title and, oh, well, we'll exalt you. It's work. There's a labor that's involved in being an elder in the Lord's church. And you look also at the idea, they're over you. That's how the New King James Version translates it. Literally, it means they lead us. They're in the lead. They're in front of us is literally the Greek language is what it means. You know, again, it's not just, to some people, I think the position of an eldership seems more like a power rank than really any work or job. But elders do a ton of work. I mean, and it's their obligation and their privilege, you know, to be in the forefront and to lead the church in the direction that it's supposed to go. That's what these elders were doing here at Thessalonica. Now, it was up to the church to follow that lead. But they stepped out and took the right steps when it came to church discipline. Also admonishing. You know, it's the job of elders to put us in mind, to remind us about things, teachings within God's Word. So we need to recognize these men. I think that's one of the words that's used there. In verse 12, New King James Version says to recognize those who labor among you. That means know who they are and know what they're worth. Know their value to a congregation. Know what they do. You know, I've been privileged to work. I've only worked with 2 congregations in my preaching career. One of them had elders, one did not. I can tell you that a congregation with eldership is a lot better than one without it. And that's not to knock the individuals. It's just saying there's organization, there's leadership. Things get done, and things are put into action and purpose. And so there's a reason God set it up that way. But we need to know what elders are worth. We need to understand how valuable they are to the church. We need to esteem them. We need to hold them very highly in our minds, count them as worthy of our love and our affection. And the result should be what? If we look at elderships that way, what should the result be? Read the last part of verse 13. Peace, right? Peace among ourselves. And that's what Paul was looking to see happen here within the church at Thessalonica. We read a little bit about the way that God wants us to treat each other, our brothers and our sisters in Christ, in verses 13 through 15. I'll just ask a couple of questions here, and you can kind of look through them as we go, and hopefully you can find the answer to them. How does God want us to treat those who are unruly? To warn them, right? What does that mean? Does that mean pat them on the back, say, good job, keep it up?
Well, if we are truly looking towards God's coming back or Jesus coming back, and we love our brothers or sisters, we want to warn them to get their act together before Christ comes back.
Yeah, we don't want to be lost ourselves, and we don't want to see anybody lost either. And so if somebody's out of line, if somebody's unruly, it's our duty as fellow Christians to warn them. What about those who are discouraged? How should we treat them? Yeah, try to comfort them, right? What about those who are weak? Yeah, hold them up, right? Support them. Who should we be patient toward? Everybody, right? Who should we refuse to pay back with evil? It's everybody, once again, right? And who should we always do good for? One another, it says, right? So that includes everyone. So God has a way that he wants us to treat each other as fellow Christians. It's important to be following that formula when Christ returns. And so keep in mind that's kind of the basis of this discussion here. Verse 17 talks about pray without ceasing. What does that mean?
Always have prayer for the Lord.
Yeah, don't neglect prayer. That's what it means. You know, pray all the time. Doesn't mean, you know, some people say, well, I don't never say amen. Well, that's, you know, don't make it an impossible application. That's not really what he's talking about. But I think it's just the tendency of man, you know, when things are going good, we don't pray as much as probably we do when things are going real bad, when we have needs. And so don't let our physical circumstance determine our prayer life. You know, stay consistent, stay fervent. Keep on praying no matter what. Why should we give thanks? Question 9 here, in all circumstances. Verse 18.
Because he's in control, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, you know, God is still God regardless of what happens to us in this life, right? And God still deserves praise and recognition. And sometimes our focus in this life is on what happens to us, when really our focus should be on God, him being in control. That's what life is all about. Regardless of what physical circumstance I find myself in, God is still on the throne. He's still God. He still deserves praise, thanksgiving, recognition. So always be thankful. How do we know we can depend on God? What's one of the reasons? Verse 24 there. He's what? He's faithful. What does that mean? It means he's going to do it, isn't it? Yeah, you can count on him. You know, we've talked about that concept a couple different ways. We talked about it, remember, with Nebuchadnezzar, the dream that God said would come upon him. We've talked about it in BBS, the promise of the destruction of the world. Negative and positive things. God's going to do whatever he says he's going to do. He's faithful. Look at his track record. Question number 11. Who was supposed to hear the contents of this letter? What was supposed to be done with it?
Read it to all the holy ones.
Yeah, read it to all the brethren, right? Why do you think that was? Why didn't Paul just say, come along in your spare time in private and go over this and think about it? Yeah, you wanted everybody to know, didn't you? You didn't want anybody to be in the dark. And I was kind of thinking about it. Do you think there's anybody in the first century church who wasn't able to read? A lot of slaves in there, weren't there? A lot of people who were not considered, mid-class or upper-class people. Probably didn't have the greatest of educations either. So a little bit of a practical application there. So
They didn't have a lot of things to pass around.
they didn't, did they? No. And the early church didn't either for a while. So, so when you get over, that's 1 Thessalonians. Anybody have any thoughts or questions or comments on that? We got like 3 minutes here to do the first chapter of 2 Thessalonians. But let me ask this question: Why do you think Paul wrote a second letter?
They mistook some things.
Why do you tell your kids 2 times to do something? Why don't you just tell them once? It's because the first time they didn't listen, right? First time they didn't get it. And so you got to remind them or you got to tell them again. And basically, 2 Thessalonians, how quickly was it written after 1 Thessalonians? Some people believe it was a matter of months. I think at the very most it would have been a year. But probably a matter of months, 2 to 3 months, that 2 Thessalonians was sent. And part of it was because they misunderstood, the first letter that Paul wrote, and so he was trying to write and correct about it. You read about the church, these are things that we've talked about. They had a reputation for growing faith. That's interesting to me because back in 1 Thessalonians 3 and verse 10, he talks about how their faith wasn't perfect. There were some things they needed to work on, but it was a growing faith. And I think that would probably, I think when we think about faith, growing faith, we want to be able to see it from hour to hour, minute to minute, and day by day. It's kind of like physical growth. If you go out and, when you were a kid, you wanted to grow so badly. You would go to the door frame, you'd mark your height. Well, what if you come back 5 minutes later and do it again? Could be any change? No. What if you do it a day? Probably not any change. Do you grow? What if you do it a year from then? There's growth. It's just slow, isn't it? And I think as Christians, we want spiritual growth to happen overnight. But I think one of the reasons we have physical growth is to teach us growth is a process. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. The main thing is that you're growing, right? And you can look at that in your own life. All of us can. And you can look back. You might say from day to day, well, I didn't do too good. I'm not making improvement. But look back a year in your life. Look back 2 years in your life. Have you grown? Are you spiritually stronger? I think all of us can answer that with a yes. And so they had a growing faith. That's what their reputation was. They had a great love for each other. They had those things in the midst of persecutions and trials. And so he talks about the return of Christ. And question number 14 is, when will God reward and punish people? What's verse 7 say?
The Lord revealed.
When Jesus returns, right? That's hard as a human to get, for me especially. It may not be as hard for you to get sunk into our minds because we look at people and we see bad things happen to them. We say, well, God is punishing them. Well, that's not the day of punishment, okay? Or as Christians, we live like we're supposed to be living and bad things happen to us. We think, well, why am I not being rewarded, for living for God? Well, today's not the day we get rewarded. The day of punishment and the day of reward is whenever Christ returns. So that's important for us to keep in mind. He described the punishment that would come upon those who rejected Christ as eternal punishment. A lot of people have problems with that today, don't they? There's an emotional appeal within the religious world to take away eternal punishment. But the Bible teaches us, were there some things that were worthy of death under the law of Moses? There was. As harsh as it may be, there were some things that were worthy of death. That's true spiritually speaking too. And so we have to be willing to accept that. Paul's prayer for the church at Thessalonica was for them to be counted worthy. We can live our lives. Now, obviously, we're never worthy of the things that God bestows upon us. But we can live our lives in a way that brings God pleasure, can't we? And so we want to do that as Christians. We want to live our lives in a way that tells God, thank you. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for making the sacrifice on your son on our behalf. That's what being counted worthy is all about. Is there satisfaction in doing good and being good? I'll tell you, it's the most rewarding life I've lived. I've lived some different lives, but this is the most rewarding. And then faith should be our work. That should be our vocation as Christians. Something that's powerful, something that's contagious. And so Paul reminds them of those things before he goes into some more discussion about the Lord's return and the timing of it. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments or anything before we end tonight? I know we had to blaze through that first chapter.